My mother and I share a great appreciation for the late Pauline Kael, who was by some called sort of the Elvis of film critics. She really changed the form, the style of being a critic. She was not afraid to say what she felt. Very opinionated, much like Christopher Hitchens was about religion. Pauline Kael was about film. Um, she lived until the age of 82. Um, Born in California, died in Massachusetts, and she died 8 days before September 11th. So it's kind of good that she didn't see that. Pauline Kael, an American film critic who wrote for the New Yorker magazine until 1991. Early in her career, she appeared in City Lights, McCall's, and The New Republic. Now, Kael was known for her witty, biting, highly opinionated, and sharply focused reviews. So she basically was not afraid to cut to the chase. This is what's happening. This is what I feel. This is it. So where maybe other film critics would um, skirt around the edges or be a little bit more careful or whatever, Kael was not afraid to cut for the jugular. But she was all, from the interviews that I saw with her and some of the stuff I've read rather. Um, she was very, very articulate and passionate about her craft. Kael was known for her witty, biting, highly opinionated, and sharply focused reviews. She left a lasting impression on many major critics, including Armand White, whose reviews are similarly nonconformist, Roger Ebert, who has said Kael had a more positive influence on the climate for film in America than any other single person over the past 30 years, 3 decades, saying she reinvented the form of criticism. Kael, an interesting history. I won't read everything here, but again, I'm taking Wikipedia and just kind of commenting on it. But in the early 80s, Kael, by the way, was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. As her illness worsened, she became increasingly depressed about the state of American films, along with feeling that, quote, I had nothing new to say. Wow. So depression really takes hold of you, grasps onto you. In March of '91, announcement which New York Times referred to as earth-shattering, Kael announced her retirement from reviewing films regularly. At the time, Kael explained that she would still write essays for the New Yorker, along with some reflections and other pieces of writing about movies. During the next 10 years, however, she published no new work besides an introduction to her 1994 compendium For Keeps. In the introduction, Kael stated in reference to her film criticism, I'm frequently asked why I don't write any memoirs. I think I have, she says. Though she published no new writing of her own, Kael was not averse to giving interviews, in which she alternately praised and derided newly released films and TV shows. In a 1998 interview with Modern Maturity, she said she sometimes regretted not being able to review a few years ago when I saw Vanya on 42nd. I wanted to blow trumpets. Your trumpets are gone once you quit. She died at her home in Massachusetts at the age of 82 in 2001, again 8 days before 9/11. Kael's opinions often ran contrary to consensus critical opinion. Occasionally she energetically championed films that were considered critical failures, such as The Warriors, Last Tango in Paris. She was not especially cruel to some films that had been roasted by many critics, such as the 1972 Man of La Mancha, and which she praised Sophia Loren's performance. She also condemned films that elsewhere attracted admiration, such as It's a Wonderful Life, West Side Story, Shoah. The originality of her opinions, as well as the forceful way in which she expressed them, won her ardent supporters as well as angry critics. So, being in the radio business, the best talk show hosts are the ones that have the highest and the lowest. So the highest ratings and the lowest ratings. So you have the most people love you and the most people dislike you. That's talent, and that's what's going to bring the ratings. That is what Kael did. She wasn't afraid to express her opinion, and the people that loved her really loved her. People that hated her just hated her guts. So Kael had a taste for anti-hero films that violated taboo involving sex and violence. and this reportedly alienated some of her readers. She also had a strong dislike for films that she felt were manipulative or appealed in superficial ways to conventional attitudes and feelings. She was particularly critical towards Clint Eastwood, and her reviews of his films and acting, even if generally well favored, were resoundingly negative. She became known as his arch nemesis. That's interesting. She was an enthusiastic, if occasionally ambivalent, supporter of Sam Peckinpah and early Walter Hill, both of whom specialized in violent action dramas. Her collection, 5001 Nights at the Movies, includes positive reviews of nearly all of Peckinpah's films, with the exception of The Gateway, as well as Hill's Hard Times. Kael responded negatively to some action films that she felt pushed what she described as right-wing or fascist agendas. She labeled Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood, as a right-wing fantasy, remarkably single-minded attack on liberal values. Wow. But he didn't have a chair in that film. She also called it fascist medievalism and an otherwise extremely positive critique of Peckinpah's Straw Dogs. Kael concluded the controversial director had made the first American film that is a fascist work of art. She had a very negative review of Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange. She explained how she felt some directors who used brutal imagery in their films were desensitizing audiences to violence. At the movies, we were gradually being conditioned to accept violence as a sensual pleasure. The directors used to say they were showing us its real face and how ugly it was in order to sensitize us to its horrors. You don't have to be very keen to see that they are now, in fact, desensitizing us. They are saying that everyone is brutal, the heroes must be as brutal as the villains, or they turn into fools. There seems to be an assumption that if you're offended by movie brutality, you are somehow playing into the hands of people who want censorship. But this would deny those of us who don't believe in censorship the use of the only counterbalance, the freedom of the press, to say that there's anything conceivably damaging in these films. The freedom to analyze their implications. If we don't use this critical freedom, we were implicitly saying that no brutality is too much for us, that only squares and people who believe in censorship are concerned with brutality. So there you go. So this is a very interesting writer. She has some compilations of her criticism, and one of which I have at home here. I haven't even picked it up. So, just a very interesting person. Top 100 interesting people of my lifetime, I think. In a preface to the 1983 interview with Kael for the gay magazine Mandate, Sam Staggs wrote that she has always carried on a love-hate affair with her gay legions. Like the bitchiest queen in gay mythology, she has a sharp remark about everything. In the early 1980s, however, largely in response to her review of Rich and Famous, 1981, Kael faced notable accusations of homophobia. First remarked by Stuart Byron in the Village Voice, according to writer Craig Siegleman. The accusations eventually took on a life of their own and did real damage to her reputation. So all it takes is one rumor and then it just goes crazy. In her review, in this review that we're talking about, Kael called the straight-themed Rich and Famous more like a homosexual fantasy, saying that one female character's affairs are creepy because they don't seem like what a woman would get into. That's a quote. In response to her review, several critics reappraised Kael's earlier reviews of gay-themed films, including a wisecrack Kael made about the lesbian-themed A Children's Hour. I always thought this was why lesbians needed sympathy, that there isn't much they can do. Craig Seligman has defended Kael at times, saying that these remarks showed enough ease with the topic to be able to crack jokes in a dark period when other reviewers felt that if homosexuality were not a crime, it would spread. Kael herself rejected the accusations as craziness, adding, "I don't see how anybody who took the trouble to check out what I've actually written about movies with homosexual elements in them could believe that stuff." Kael has often been quoted as having said in the wake of Richard Nixon's landslide victory in the 1972 election that she couldn't believe Nixon had won, since no one she knew had voted for him. The quote is sometimes cited by conservatives as an example of cluelessness and insularity among the liberal elite. There are variations as to the exact wording, so that's more controversy. She was definitely not afraid to give her political opinion. She had many influences. Almost as soon as she began writing for The New Yorker, Kael carried a great deal of influence among fellow critics. In the early 70s, Cinerama distributors initiated a policy of individual screenings for each critic because her remarks were affecting her fellow critics. That's amazing, isn't it? In the 70s and 80s, Kael cultivated friendships with a group of young, mostly male critics, some of whom emulated her distinctive writing style, referred to derisively as the Paulettes. They came to dominate national film criticism in the 90s. Critics who have acknowledged Kael's influence include, among many, A.O. Scott of the New York Times, David Denby, Anthony Lane of the New Yorker, David Edelstein of New York Magazine, Greil Marcus, Elvis Mitchell, Michael Sargo. The list goes on and on. When asked in 1998 if she thought her criticism had affected the way films were made, Kael deflected the question, saying, "If I say yes, I'm an egotist. If I say no, I've wasted my entire life." Several directors' careers were indisputably affected by her, though most notably that of taxi driver writer Paul Schrader, who accepted a UCLA Film School's graduate program on Kael's recommendation. Under her mentoring, Schrader worked as a film critic before taking up screenwriting and directing full-time. Also, film critic Derek Malcolm claimed that if a director was praised by Kael, he or she was generally allowed to work, since the money men knew there would be a similar approbation across the wide field of publications. In 1978, she was awarded the Women in Crystal Award for outstanding women who, through their endurance and excellence of their work, have helped to expand the role of women within the entertainment industry. The career of Pauline Kael is discussed at length in For the Love of Movies, the story of American film criticism, by critics who helped with their careers, by critics whom she helped, that is, with their careers, such as Owen Gleiberman and Elvis Mitchell, as well as those who fought with her, such as Andrew Sarris. The 2009 documentary film also shows several Kael appearances on PBS, including speaking together with Woody Allen. In his 1988 film Willow, George Lucas named one of the villains General Kael after the critic. Isn't that interesting? Kael had often reviewed Lucas's work without enthusiasm. In her own review of Willow, she described the character as an homage à moi. So there we go, Pauline Kael. I got to read more of her. At this stage in my life, I guess I want to be able to soak in as much reading, good reading, as I can. The mind is something not to waste. Don't waste the mind. Okay. I really like this string I'm on with. I might just call it People I Enjoy, or People on Wiki. Maybe People on Wiki series. And basically, I'm just looking up. It's not nuclear science. I'm just looking things up on Wiki and then making comments on people I've really admired. And I would say this probably, if I had to really search them out. We talk about writers and actors and sports heroes and teachers, politicians, people that I have admired. There's probably at least 1,000 of them that I could do. So this thing could go on for a long time. So this is kind of neat. So this would be paying homage to some of my I guess you could say some of my mentors. Really, these are people that all taught me something. From Pauline Kael to John Updike to Philip Roth, and Kurt Vonnegut. They've all taught me some things about life. So there you go.